morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Fragile truce, market euphoria fades as Iran says several terms of its ceasefire with the U.S. have been breached, with Vice President JD Vance set to lead a U.S. delegation in the Islamabad talks this weekend. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi says the U.S. must choose between the ceasefire or continued war via Israel after the Israeli military says it struck more than 100 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon within 10 minutes. And oil rebounds after its biggest one-day drop since April 2020 as the Strait of Hormuz remains largely blocked, falling short of a key U.S. condition for the ceasefire. Well, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Zeina Rizk in Dubai. 24 hours, a little longer since that ceasefire was announced. And the big question people are asking is it actually going to hold? We've got some key discussions taking place in Islamabad this weekend. Also questions about whether the Iranian delegation is even going to show up after they have cited multiple violations to the terms of the ceasefire agreement. So on the back of that, the handover from markets today, a lot more cautious than the price action that we had yesterday. Let's just take a look at MSCI Asia Pacific tending towards the green, down about 0.9%. And this after a very robust close yesterday for Wall Street. A bit of a disparity between sentiment for global stock markets yesterday versus actually what was panning out on the ground. And the fact that there were still projectiles being launched towards Gulf states even hours after that ceasefire was announced. So some questions really about the sustainability of the ceasefire and whether it actually is in effect. S&P futures leaning towards the negative as well, down 0.2%. I will say outside the realm of the war and anything related to the war in the region, we also had the FOMC minutes come through yesterday. And the takeaway there was they were slightly more hawkish than the market had anticipated, and many officials citing some of the upside risks coming from those inflation risks down the track on back of the energy shock, but then also more robust than expected labor data. So something to bear in mind as we think about the trajectory of the U.S. economy. And then oil, let's take a look at where Brent is today, up 2%, just shy of $97 a barrel. And this clearly a reflection of the fact that, number one, we've got this fragile truce, as JD Vance described it, but at the same time, the Strait of Hormuz is still effectively shut, and not many ships have been able to transfer through in the last 24 hours. We'll talk about that more shortly. And then the USD basically trading sideways today, but getting a bit of love because of the risk-off sentiment that's prevailing in markets once again. Switching over, let's take a look at the terminal charts. And I thought something, again, just to highlight, the amount of volume that's gone into the S&P over the last couple of days. And here you can see that it has actually bounced very hard. At one point, the technical indicators were suggesting that it had become oversold. And now you have seen a wave of buying emerge again into what international investors view as an imminent resolution to the situation in the region. And of course, that is one of the reasons why S&P and broader Wall Street indices did so well yesterday. So the technicals are pointing to quite a strong rebound in U.S. equities. Speaking of equities, let's also dive a little bit deeper into how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in Singapore for us. Avril, run us through the markets today.
Yeah, Joanna, to your point about the positioning, that backdrop of the U.S. stocks being oversold and how we may be expecting a bit of that rebound coming in strong, you also got that context for Asia stocks following on from that 5% climb on the region's benchmark yesterday and those double-digit surges in the tech heavyweights. So take that into consideration, even as we see that note of caution in Asia today. Stocks are slipping across the major indices. Tech is also on a downward slide. You have to consider what we saw just a day ago. That being said, yes, we are seeing some other drivers as well. The release of Meta, Anthropic, AI-related tools is putting pressure on some of these software names, although some of our colleagues have also highlighted when it comes to Meta joining the AI model fray, that is also perhaps an indication that not all tech is created equal in a sense. You can see maybe the memory, the server-related tech names benefiting as a trade. But that note of caution as oil edges higher, that is clear today. Jumana?
April Hong in Singapore, thank you so much. Now back to our top story today. Iran says several terms of its ceasefire with the United States have been breached, and sporadic fighting continues in the region, with the Strait of Hormuz still largely blocked. In Lebanon, the Israeli military said it carried out its largest operation against Hezbollah since the start of the Iran war, saying it had targeted more than 100 of the militia's command centers and military sites in just 10 minutes. The White House says Vice President JD Vance will lead a U.S. delegation in talks in Islamabad this weekend.
No ceasefire ever goes without a little bit of choppiness. What we have been very clear about is that we want to stop the bombing. We want our allies to stop the bombing, and we want the Iranians to do the same thing. We're seeing evidence that things are going in the right direction, but it's going to take a little time.
Joining me now is Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, Bloomberg's executive editor for Middle East, North Africa, and Russia. I mean, Stuart, I guess the question here, 24 hours on, is what is the status of the ceasefire? Is it actually holding?
Good morning, Jumana. So, yes, it does appear to be holding as of now, but, you know, as the Vice President said, and he's right, that these things tend to be quite choppy in the start, and we've seen that in Gaza, we've seen that in Lebanon, we've saw that even with the 12-day war with Iran last year, where there were sort of supposed violations of the ceasefire sometime after it came into force. The difficulty with this one is that there are so many different theatres, in effect, that are taking place that it's very hard to see what exactly is going on minute by minute. But the anecdotal evidence overnight is that things seem to be calming down in the Gulf. We did see some attacks yesterday, notably in Kuwait, but overnight and into this morning, so far, again, it's been reasonably quiet. Now, does that constitute a full ceasefire? Clearly not. Is that an improvement on the situation from 48 hours ago? I would argue yes.
At the same time, we know that in-person negotiations are meant to happen in Islamabad this weekend, but could those talks be derailed by Israel's ongoing strikes in Lebanon?
Yeah, I think very much so. And it's sort of one of a number of points that's come to the fore in terms of what Iran has said about the ceasefire and the period after the ceasefire supposedly came into place. So yes, it's been about the nuclear fire, particularly the right to enrichment. Yes, it's also been about control of Hormuz, but Lebanon absolutely has come up as a big, big point of contention. As far as the Iranians are concerned, they say their understanding going into this that Lebanon would be included in the broad ceasefire. That is not the position of the US, nor is it the position of Israel. So as they go into these talks, we presume from Saturday morning, you can imagine that's going to be pretty high up on the agenda.
What is going to be discussed at these talks? So what is our anticipation of, what the foundation of these discussions are going to be?
So, I mean, I think number one, they have to agree on what exactly are the talking points, because what we've seen over the last 48 hours or so, and arguably, I suppose, over the last several weeks, is some real differences of opinion about what is on the table for discussion. Now, as far as the Iranians are concerned, enrichment is not up for discussion. Their right to have weapons, notably missiles, not up for discussion. The right to have free passage through Hormuz with no Iranian say or a toll system, not up for discussion. These are all things that, as far as we can tell from the US side, are absolutely at the forefront of what they want to get out of these negotiations. So I think step one is coming to a series of basically key points that they can negotiate around. And I don't think we're even at that stage yet. There's some real confusion, for instance, about what's in the 15-point plan, what's in the 10-point plan, and however many other points you want to come up with. There's been lots of permutations, but the key areas haven't gone away.
Yeah, and also the US suggesting that the 10-point plan that they had been privy to was very different from the one that Iran published in the middle of the night yesterday. So to your point, there still remains a lot of discrepancy about exactly what was discussed when the ceasefire was agreed to. Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, our executive editor for Middle East, North Africa, and Russia. Thank you. Well, let's continue the conversation now with Fasih Mangi, Bloomberg's Pakistan bureau chief. Fasih, really good to have you with us. So, as Stuart gave us a little bit of a preview into the talks that are expected to take place in Islamabad this weekend, talk us through the role Pakistan has played in bridging all of the differences and bringing all the sides together for what is expected to be a crucial set of talks this weekend.
Thank you, Jemana. Pakistan has played a very crucial and critical role. What it has been able to leverage on is that Pakistan has become a trusted, become a trusted ally to the U.S. in the past year or so. It has growing relations with Trump, so it has leveraged on that. And on the other side, Iran is a neighbor to Pakistan. They've had close historic ties again, and Pakistan is able to, gather all the Muslim countries together, and they've had a defense agreement with Saudi Arabia last year as well, which just forged more relations with them and other countries. So it seems to be a joint effort led by Pakistan, but on the backdrop, Turkey has played a role, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and a lot of other countries, and China as well.
I want to ask you about a big question that has emerged in the last few hours, and that is whether Lebanon was actually included in the initial ceasefire talks. And I want to refer back to a post that your Prime Minister, Mr. Sharif, put up during the course of last night, suggesting that the terms had been agreed to and that the ceasefire would also apply to Lebanon. Later on, White House officials actually denied that and said that Lebanon was not a part of the discussions. I guess the question is, why would the Pakistani Prime Minister put up a post suggesting that Lebanon was part of the deal if it wasn't?
I think we've seen overnight and over the past few days that there are some conflicting words that are going around, and I think in general, what we understand is that the Prime Minister wanted, or the expectation was that everything would come to a standstill. But as JD Vance last night said, that there are some slippages that happen, and I think the slippages are a bit more than what the Pakistani side expected, and that is why he has come out and he said that he's urging all parties to call for restraint until the talks happen. Another thing that we know is that talks were initially supposed to happen on Friday, and then the date was changed to Saturday. That also says that there are a lot of moving parts that are happening. Pakistan was anticipating it so much that Islamabad was declared as they declared a holiday in Islamabad for Thursday and Friday in anticipation of the talks, but now they've been moved to Saturday. So I'm assuming they will announce another holiday for Saturday as well. But that just tells you how fluid things are right now. So if talks happen on Saturday, it seems so at this point, but you never know. If any attack could change the situation.
Fasih, really great to have you on. Thank you so much. Fasih Mangi, Bloomberg's Pakistan bureau chief. Now, joining me now is Alan Eyre, a former senior U.S. diplomat and distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. Alan Eyre, I should say, I always get it wrong. Good to have you with us on the show. I'm going to go back to the question that I asked our colleague Stuart, which is whether you believe that this ceasefire is actually going to hold and whether it will actually last the 2 weeks that was suggested yesterday.
Well, I actually don't think it ever took place. So it's not a question of it holding. I'm still waiting for it to be established. The only entity that is observing the ceasefire to any extent is the American military. Obviously, the key violator at this point is Israel with its attacks on Lebanon. It seems to be the case that President Trump, right before announcing the ceasefire, informed Israel of the contents and that it would include Lebanon. Israel had not signed off on that. And so when the message was, I think, passed to the Pakistan Prime Minister, it caught Israel by surprise when it came out. So Israel has no intention of stopping its attacks on Lebanon. That's the main threat to the ceasefire. In addition, even in the best case, Iran is only going to let about 10 to 15 ships through per day. So I don't know how that squares with President Trump asking for a full resumption of maritime traffic through the Strait.
Could Israel's strikes on Lebanon bring down the whole ceasefire agreement?
Well, to an extent, it already has. Iran has once again said that the strait is closed. So I'm sure there's frantic behind the scenes efforts from all countries involved, to include Pakistan, to try to get all sides to honor the ceasefire. But yeah, it could topple it. And I mean, even if we get to the negotiations, which is going to be tough, the odds of a successful negotiating process coming out of it are themselves very slim.
Well, this is what I was going to ask you. You know, going into these in-person negotiations this weekend, assuming they still do happen, because also that's a big question mark, what would be deemed a successful outcome in order for us to move on from this temporary truce into a more permanent cessation of hostilities? What would be, you know, some outcomes that would be acceptable and therefore something that the rest of the world can build on?
Well, first of all, I think it's going to take more than 2 weeks, which is why both sides have said that extensions are possible. For the U.S., I think, I mean, unfortunately, the red lines of the two sides have moved farther apart as a result of this war. And the Iranian government or regime is far more militaristic and hardline than the one before the war. But as JD Vance, Vice President Vance, has said, the essential demand of the United States is an end to the Iran nuclear program, zero enrichment in Iran, no uranium on Iranian soil. That's what he mentions primarily. He hasn't mentioned anything about rockets or missiles. But on Iran's side, they have new demands. They've discovered new strategic leverage. They've weaponized and monetized control of the Strait of Hormuz. So they want to hold on to that. So they want to make that an institution going forward, their ability to toll ships going through, which I don't think the United States will be willing, and the Gulf countries will be willing to stand for. And so also Iran wants a lot of money. They will have a very close demand.
And here's the thing, Alan, even before the war started, we were reporting on the various rounds of nuclear discussions that were taking place between the two sides in Geneva. It just seems as though after almost 6 weeks of this war now, Iran is maintaining the talking points that they had even prior to the war, but they've added a few new ones, including their right to sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, Jomana, that's because their strategic position now is better than it was before the war started, as hard as that is to believe, because America has used its big stick, its big threat of military might, and it wasn't enough. Iran didn't surrender, it didn't collapse, it didn't capitulate. So the US and Israel don't have that many new tricks in the bag. But also, Iran has found a new strategic deterrent, which is control of the strait. So, as I said, as weird as it sounds, Iran has strategic leverage going into these talks, especially because President Trump just wants this whole issue to go away. He's got elections coming up. He doesn't want to see the economy collapse.
Yeah.
So he just wants to call to victory and move on.
Yeah, okay. So, you know, and the way Trump likes to see things is through a very commercial lens. Even yesterday in one of his Truth Social posts, he talked about the possibility of lifting sanctions and tariffs. So he's thinking about perhaps a commercial incentive to get a deal done with Iran. I just wonder whether on the other side, that would be so appealing to the Iranians that they would be actually willing to sacrifice one of their key proxies in the region, that is Hezbollah, in the name of the lifting of sanctions. Do you see them going that far?
They're very loath to get rid of Hezbollah. Hezbollah attacked Israel during this war. They don't want to lose future use of their proxy network by not coming to their aid when they're in trouble. And in terms of money, they're going to need a lot of it, but they've found it, which is the Tehran toll on maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, which is why they're trying to hardwire that into any negotiations agreement. Yes, they'd also like sanctions lifted, and that's why it's going to be so hard, because Iran's demands now as a result of this war and their feeling of strategic momentum are going to be more than they were before the war.
Alan, always good to chat to you. Thank you so much for coming on. Alan Eyre, former senior U.S. diplomat and distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. Thank you. Well, Asian stocks have declined as optimism over the U.S.-Iran ceasefire fades. This comes as Tehran says several terms of the agreement have been breached, highlighting lingering uncertainty in markets. Joining us is Paul Gambles, co-founder and managing partner at MBMG Group. Paul, really good to chat to you. It's been a while since we last spoke. How are you thinking about markets and the various headlines that have come through about the war? I mean, yesterday was a very good case in point where you got the ceasefire headline, obviously devil in the detail, but the reaction on Wall Street was one of pure exuberance.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, we have to kind of take a bit of a step back because, some of the reactions that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis are just, bordering on, extreme. So I think, there's a couple of points that we're not hearing sort of made frequently enough. One is that, is this a real ceasefire? We were pretty skeptical at the start. When you're negotiating with Trump and Netanyahu, then you're not really negotiating in good faith, are you? So it was always going to be ceasefire for thee, but not for me, and that's kind of how it seems to be playing out. So that was we always had doubts about that. I guess the second thing is that we also we have real doubts that even if there is any way of reaching a satisfactory conclusion now, and I take what your previous speaker was saying, I think America is desperate to find a way out of this. But even if there is a way of finding a conclusion, it doesn't automatically go back to sort of a reset, antebellum. It's not going to be exactly as things were, just a few weeks ago. And then the final point is actually a few weeks ago things weren't all that great anyway. We were already starting to see fractures appearing in a lot of parts, certainly the most vulnerable parts of capital markets. We were starting to see private credit roll over. We were starting to see the air go out of the AI bubble.
Yeah.
So you add all those three things together, and I think you definitely have to be cautious and not get caught up in one-day exuberance.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, is it fair to say then, for as long as this war or fragile truce continues, that it's going to continue to hang over global markets, especially if it means that the Strait of Hormuz is still effectively closed?
Absolutely. I mean, that's going to be a major hangover because obviously, we see the impact that higher energy costs have and the threat of ongoing higher energy costs. So we've seen that. So obviously it's the thing that dominates. But as I say, the thing is when the tide actually goes out, when we do reach some kind of an end to this, then we can't just expect that it's going to be happy days again. I think that's going to reveal, as I say, a lot of these cracks that are there. And I think particularly private credit and what that means for the AI bubble is the one that's really being exposed right now. And I don't think there's any way of putting that genie back in the bottle. I think this could be terminal for the private credit bubble, for the AI bubble, even if we do get a resolution.
Wow. So what is the way that you're looking to express that view? Do you have short exposure to certain, ETFs or baskets that track those underlying names, or is it just at NASDAQ level?
So yeah, I think there's various ways of sort of playing this. When the invasion happened, we took out a short-term option on the oil price. We've already, we closed that about a week ago, maybe 10 days ago. That was a nice short-term payoff, but that's not really sustainable. In terms of sustainable, we're looking at the things that we thought were going to be the places to be going into this, because as I say, the fundamentals weren't great on the way into that. So for equity, I think it's very much long short, and you probably want to have really active managers doing the heavy lifting for you, because the problem is it's really hard to go and be to take a significant short position because of the fact that the rebounds can still be so extreme. So you don't want to get caught out by that. So I mean, people will make a lot of money by shorting ARC and things like that, but and obviously there's an ETF that can do that for you. But for us, we'd rather take a more gradualist position, which is using the big, long-established, long-short guys to go and do that. I think the one sea change that we've seen over the last few months is that we were obviously massively overweight gold for quite a long time, but we're now pretty much out of, or very much reduced in terms of gold exposure, because gold just isn't behaving like gold anymore. And if you look through this recent crisis, gold has shown an extremely high downside correlation with the tech stocks. So you can't use gold as a hedge. Maybe you can use it as a risk asset, but that's not why we were attracted to gold in the first place. So we're no longer seeing gold as a hedge, which leaves you falling back on things like U.S. Treasuries, and also we had as Linda here in Bangkok a couple of months ago, and I was talking to her and saying it was on the day of the Japanese election. I was saying, we'll probably see yen go out to 160, but when we do, that's probably the screaming trade of the year. Buy yen at 160 because that probably is the ultimate defensive trade at that stage.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're basically there, or we got there. Paul Campbell, it's always good to chat to you. Thank you so much, co-founder and managing partner at MBMG Group. Well, let's take a look at how some of the local indices closed after the first day of the tenuous ceasefire, and it was a sea of green out there. So you can see the Tadawul shot up 2.3%, though of course later in the afternoon there were some reports of drones being intercepted over that crucial east-west pipeline. Reportedly has caused limited damage, though. At the Dubai Stock Exchange, take a look there, up almost 7% yesterday in trading. So very, very robust price action. And Abu Dhabi also up 2.9%, the Egyptian Stock Exchange up 4%. So a day of green yesterday for these local indices. But coming up, we're also going to dive into the bond market reaction in the region with Zeina Rizk, a fixed income co-head at Amwal Capital Partners. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Fragile truce, market euphoria fades as Iran says several terms of its ceasefire with the U.S. have been breached, with Vice President JD Vance set to lead a U.S. delegation in the Islamabad talks this weekend. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi says the U.S. must choose between the ceasefire or continued war with Israel via Israel after the Israeli military says it struck more than 100 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon within 10 minutes. Killing at least 182 people. And oil rebounds after its biggest one-day drop since April 2020 as the Strait of Hormuz remains largely blocked, falling short of a key U.S. condition for the ceasefire. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johanna Bersachi in Dubai. Well, markets have started to sour in terms of mood overnight. The handover from Asia Pacific leaning towards more negative, some cautiousness about the state of the ceasefire, whether it's actually going to hold in this part of the world. So more cautious from some of these Asian indices, in contrast with the very positive reaction we had on Wall Street yesterday with some of those key names ending up more than 2% higher. So broad rally we saw for the S&P today. Things are taking their cue, I guess, from the Asian sentiment. S&P futures dipping south, down 0.2%. And then Brent, take a look. We are back up very close to $100 a barrel again. $97 is where we're at, up 2.5%. We'll talk more about that in just a moment, what's going on in the energy space. And then USD trading sideways, but saw a bit of a bid emerge this morning as risk sentiment turns south. Now, switching over, just the terminal that I wanted to pick up on today, and the fact that it seems as though investors have once again started to buy in to the S&P. It's bounced hard off what technical analysts would say are oversold levels. This has happened in the last couple of days or so. Optimism around the status of the ceasefire in the Middle East and upcoming negotiations, the possibility of a breakthrough. And of course, I would just say on the ground, sentiment here is a lot more cautious versus the price action that we are seeing in the S&P. But this does tell you that money is going back in to the U.S. U.S. stock market once again. So interesting to note that. Okay, let's also talk about some of the price action in Asia today in more detail. Avril Hong is in Singapore for us. Avril.
Yeah, Jumana, given how the fragility of the truce is a consideration and traffic through the strait essentially is still halted and the blockage is still a consideration, you're seeing oil prices, as you well know, taking higher. So Asia stocks are under pressure today, and the markets of Japan, South Korea, which of course were among those that led the way higher, along with the tech-led rebound, which saw double-digit surges. Those are kind of the stocks that are coming under pressure today. It's also not just about the FOMC minutes. Think about the Asian central banks, the likes of the Bank of Korea, that is a decision that's due tomorrow. And it's expected to stay on hold, but given how oil prices have remained at these elevated levels for long enough, there is a risk of hawkish guidance. That being said, you also get a sense that some investors are banking on the idea that Trump wants to move past this war, and then add to that some of these signs when you look at indicators, volatility among them for Asia indices, following on from the spike of volatility given the outbreak of the war. You've seen that quite consistently fading. So to some, that is also a bit of a positive indicator for what might come when it comes to Asia stocks. Jumana?
Avril, thank you so much. Avril Hong in Singapore. Let's go back to the energy space. Oil rebounding after its biggest one-day drop since April 2020. As the Strait of Hormuz remained largely blocked and Israeli attacks on Lebanon threatened to derail the fragile ceasefire in the Middle East. Joining me now is Bloomberg's Middle East energy reporter, Anthony DePaula. Anthony, earlier I was noting that we saw this very strong, exuberant reaction in equity markets yesterday, but not so much the case oil. Initially you had the cratering after the ceasefire was announced, but slowly throughout the course of the day, we started inching higher and higher and higher up again. Is it fair to say that for energy market participants, so long as the Straits has an unknown fate at this point, effectively still closed and monitored by Iran, that we're going to continue to see upward pressure on oil markets?
Yeah, Jumana, good morning. I think that inherent risk remains, and so that is going to be a bullish factor for prices. As you said, we had that big drop yesterday as markets really priced in a ceasefire in terms of positive news, because we did avoid a major escalation. But as it went through the day, in fact, once we got into early hours of trading in the United States, we saw the oil price going even a little bit lower as the U.S. market really bought into that idea of the ceasefire. But as we saw going through the day that Hormuz was not open and that barrels were not going through the strait, then that kind of tampered some of that loss. And we did also have that attack hours after the ceasefire was announced. We did have that attack on a major Saudi pipeline in Saudi Arabia. That's the East-West pipeline that runs across the country. That was hit. A pumping station was hit. We understand it was not major damage and flows weren't interrupted, but still, the fact that major outlet could be hit is a serious issue for the markets. Kind of, we could almost see that as a message from Iran telling the Saudis, if you're not going to come through Hormuz and pay us, you're not going to export via your alternate. So that is an issue. So we're not seeing those flows. We're not seeing that come back, and we would likely see some continued pressure on oil today, Jumana.
Yeah, and there are reports that 2 Chinese vessels are attempting to pass through the Strait. I mean, give us more color about the activity that we've seen, or attempted activity to pass through the Strait of Hormuz in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, well, traders, producers, consumers in Asia, they want to see free flow of oil through the strait. That means not having to coordinate with the Iranian military authorities and certainly not having to pay. We've already seen that in the run-up to the ceasefire anyway, where some vessels were going through, and we have seen some barrels going to China. So the main buyer of Iranian crude is China. Iran has sent some of its own vessels there even during the war, kept its own exports relatively stable. So really, getting tankers going to China is not really a change in the sense that we're not getting more oil onto the broader open market. But what we need is really barrels going to places like India, Korea, China, Japan. So we really need those barrels going to the open market. 2 tankers going to China is kind of a status quo ante, so that's not really going to move the needle that much, and it's not really going to be signifying a true opening of the Strait, Jumana.
Yeah, I'm going to do a little plug for the terminal here. There's a very cool function that we have called Map Space Vessels Go. If you want to take a look at the status of the vessels that are sort of stranded around the Persian Gulf and what's going through the Straits, I highly recommend for you to take a look at that function. Bloomberg's Middle East energy reporter Anthony Tapaula, thank you so much for bringing us the latest. Well, markets are reacting sharply to the latest developments around the Iran ceasefire, with an initial rally in bonds and a drop in oil prices quickly reversing, as you were just speaking about, as questions emerge over how durable the truce really is. Joining us now to discuss is Zeina Rizk, co-head of fixed income at Amwal Capital Partners. Before we went to the break, in the last segment, Zeina, I was talking about the very strong rally that we saw in some of the local regional bourses. Dubai Stock Exchange was up almost 7%. This is the strongest day since 2014. Did that also translate into credit yesterday as well?
Good morning, Romana. Yes, indeed. We did have a strong rally in credit across the board. High yield obviously outperformed, given that it had underperformed during the downturn. And yesterday we've had across the board a relief rally. But as you also mentioned before the break, there is some cautiousness that came in the afternoon and around the market flows.
How would you describe the sort of credit widening that we saw in and around the duration of this war that was going on for 40 days? And you can say that we're in a state of ceasefire right now, but would you say that some names got disproportionately hit, or was it mostly orderly?
In fact, indeed, the movement was very interesting. So we started with a massive sell-off of Dubai real estate name, rightly so, because they are the most exposed to the uncertainty that is happening. But the more interesting thing was, so the Dubai real estate was sold mainly because people were positioning at the beginning, and it was exacerbated by short selling. And then moving past that, when these companies came back to the market and spoke to investors, you had some sort of comfort that led them to go back to go back from the lows. And yesterday, obviously, with the rally, they recovered. On the broader scope in the IG space, we did see some general widening. But the interesting thing is the markets never discounted the full-blown war. The market went back to around Liberation Day, the tariff times widening, but we didn't really discount the potential that could war this happen. I'm not sure if it's complacency or if it's a general sense of this war will not last and it's temporary.
Yeah, and Zeina, who have been the main buyers into some of this weakness? Is it local or international investors?
We've seen a combination of both. We've seen the interesting thing is that, I mean, in normal times in this situation, you get a sense of sell now and ask questions later when you have the choice to move away. The interesting part is that international investors did not dump the general market. We still had support, and coming back into the market, we've seen locals repositioning across following the first 2 weeks of the conflict, and then we've seen internationals also tapping in, either adding or building positions across different curves and across both IG and high yield in the curve.
Yeah, a question, I guess, as it pertains to sort of broader global fixed income markets and what's happening with the U.S. Treasury curve now. We've seen this massive flattening. At the beginning of the year, everyone was in steepeners. Is that also translating into you thinking about extending your duration along some of these local credit curves as well?
We're cautious. So going into that conflict, we were underweight duration. We were very low on duration. And then the first week, we reduced that further. We started increasing it a bit, but we remain cautious because, as you mentioned earlier, the ceasefire doesn't seem to be very solid at this point. And given the inflationary pressure, because if oil remains high for an extended period of time, then this moves from being a transitory blip in inflation to potentially becoming a structural problem, an inflationary problem, and add to that the deficit and the additional fiscal cost of that war. I think this might cause pressure on the long end and cause the long end to twist higher. Those are still risks. We're still not there yet, but these are things that we're watching, and we'd rather remain cautious on duration at this point.
Yeah, do you have a view on what the Fed may end up doing? Obviously, we had the Fed minutes yesterday, came in slightly more hawkish on back of the knock-on effects of the Iran war, the uncertainties that that's going to have on the U.S. economy. But are you in the cutting or in the hiking camp for the Fed this year? And it even feels funny asking that question.
Exactly, it's a pretty interesting. It's a pretty interesting question at this point. It's early to say. Uncertainty is still very wide. We still don't know where the conflict and if the conflict will end and the impact of that conflict. I don't think the Fed will rush to cut because there's no need for the Fed to rush into cutting, given that especially the employment figures that we've recently got and the risk of inflation. So I think they will remain on hold until we have clarity, significantly better clarity.
Zeina, thank you so much. Always good to talk to you. Zeina Rizk, co-head of fixed income at Amwal Capital Partners. Well, coming up, Israel intensifies strikes against Lebanon despite the U.S.-Iran ceasefire. We'll discuss the latest next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johanna Versace in Dubai. Israel has intensified its strikes against Lebanon, carrying out one of its largest assaults yet against what it describes as Hezbollah targets, killing at least 182 people and wounding hundreds. The escalation comes despite a ceasefire announcement, with Iran saying Israel should also hold fire in Lebanon, while the U.S. and Israel insist Lebanon is not covered, raising fresh questions about negotiations before they've even started this weekend. For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Dan, I've got to wonder whether the reason that the Israeli Prime Minister has turned his sights on Lebanon is because there was so much public backlash yesterday that Israel were not privy to the ceasefire discussions that took place between U.S. and Iran. Is this in reaction to some of that public sentiment?
I think that might be reading too much into this. Keep in mind that quite aside from the disruption of life and the risks to life in Lebanon caused by such actions, and Israel does have an interest in keeping the Lebanon mainstream, if not on its side, then at least sufficiently neutral to be able to hold some kind of peace talks in the future. I do think Israel was involved in this. It's worth remembering that this truce dovetailed perfectly with the end of a Jewish holiday, the resumption of school studies that have now indeed resumed in much of the country, as well as flights. There are suggestions this wasn't such a surprise to Israel. However, you're correct in noting that the Lebanon front is very important to Israel. It has been pretty much from the outset of this war in Iran, though it is the second front to this war. It has been eclipsed for much of the world by what's been going on in Iran. Not so for millions of Lebanese, not so for millions of Israelis, given the sheer proximity there, the sheer stakes of having a continued friction point in southern Lebanon with a Hezbollah presence there. The question is whether by stepping up these attacks on what it says was new hiding places being used by Hezbollah in the Lebanese interior, including in residential areas, including around the capital, Israel, whatever was gained militarily here, is risking tipping the balance of latent support that actions against Hezbollah may have among the Lebanese mainstream. That remains to be seen. However, for weeks now, the Israelis have been saying that they will pursue the campaign in Lebanon independent of whatever develops in Iran. So we should not be surprised at all that the Israelis did not want Lebanon included in the ceasefire. They apparently got the United States to agree to its non-inclusion in the ceasefire. Trump said so explicitly, and they will continue to pursue that campaign in Lebanon to an end that may be a tall order, but the Israelis appear quite firm on pursuing it for now.
I should say that the Lebanese Prime Minister also declared today a national day of mourning, given the very high death count that ensued from on the back of those strikes yesterday. To your point about the ceasefire, I think there were a few hours yesterday morning where it was unclear for Lebanese and even Lebanese officials whether Lebanon was actually included in that regional ceasefire. Later transpired that obviously from Israel's perspective, Lebanon was not part of the agreement. But what does this mean for the broader ceasefire agreement and whether it can actually hold? Because overnight, the Iranians have said that unless Israel abide by the terms of the ceasefire terms that Iran put forward, which includes halting operations against Hezbollah, then in their eyes, the ceasefire doesn't hold anymore.
That's a very good point. It's worth noting, however, that JD Vance, who's heading up the US delegation at these talks with Iran, scheduled to take place on Saturday in Pakistan, or I should say the White House quite literally trashed those Iranian points, that 10-point plan. The White House spokeswoman saying they were thrown in the bin from the outset. So there's one thing to place demands and to publicize them around the world. It's quite another to argue that those demands were accepted at the outset by your adversary before the talks have even begun. So yes, I think as long as the Iranians aren't willing to upset this apple cart, to resume attacks fully against Israel, to carry out on their veiled threat to do so over Lebanon, one should presume that truce talks will continue and that Lebanon will be excluded. This is now not only an Israeli claim, the exclusion of Lebanon, it is one also stated by the United States, which is not a small factor in these talks, which is a major player in these talks and in this war. So what you have is the allies who carried out the war being in agreement on this point about Lebanon versus Iran, potentially also Pakistan. The Pakistani prime minister also talked about Lebanon being excluded. The big question is, if this is a deal breaker for Iran, let's see it break the deal. For now, it does not appear to be doing so. For now, those talks in Pakistan appear to be on track. And I think we should at least watch the first round to see what happens. I would add, it's possible that the Israelis expect, and the Americans, that they will change their terms, in which case this would be the parting shot before Israel holds fire in Lebanon.
Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem, thank you so much for bringing us the latest. Well, let's talk about the Gulf perspective. Gulf states are reacting cautiously to the US-Iran ceasefire as attacks continue across the region. Officials say while the deal has eased fears of a broader escalation, key issues remain unresolved. For more, we're now joined by Sam Dahed, Bloomberg senior Middle East reporter. Sam, maybe just talk us through the reaction that we've seen from Gulf states to the announcement of the ceasefire and whether actually they believe that this is going to lead to a longer-term cessation of hostilities.
Very good to be with you, Jumana. I mean, first of all, it's important to note that there is a collective sigh of relief across the Gulf that the worst has not materialized, at least for now, because they knew that they were going to bear the brunt of any retaliation by the Iranian regime to President Trump's threats to quote him, wipe out Iran's civilization and attack its civilian infrastructure, including power plants. So there is this relief, but at the same time, there's a lot of question marks, a lot of uncertainty mixed in with some trepidation over the terms of the ceasefire, whether even if it applies to them, given that the attacks that we've seen yesterday. Obviously, Lebanon is a complication, and now Israel saying that Lebanon is not part of the deal, and Iran signaling that it is, and it would continue to block the Strait of Hormuz if Israel continues to attack Lebanon. And most crucially for the Gulf states is actually the fate of the Strait of Hormuz itself. So far, it appears that Iran, controls the strait. It's going to decide who goes through and who doesn't. It speaks about coordination with its military, and it's so far apparent that it intends to levy this toll, and this is completely unacceptable to them. But I think it's important to note that while all Gulf states have the same core concerns, I mean, also the other important thing to note is that the maximalist demands that Iran put forward suggest that the hardline faction that's actually in charge of the country, the IRGC and others, may not actually be interested in a deal. I mean, they're putting forward these maximalist demands at the moment, including seeing U.S. forces out of the region. But just going back to Gulf states. I think it's important to note that while they share the same core concerns, their approaches and strategies are going to differ in terms of how they tackle this and how they respond to this. And we see it even in public statements. I mean, the UAE put out 2 statements yesterday, one saying it's seeking clarifications to the ceasefire terms. And in another one in which it cited the Minister of State, Lana Nusseibi, it spoke of Iran's quote unquote economic terrorism. And it said that the UAE won't sit idly, and that it would continue to work with its partners in the UN and outside the UN to actually change the situation. And in contrast, you had the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia putting out a statement, a very circumspect statement, welcoming Pakistan's role in mediation and praising it, and simply speaking about the freedom of navigation in Hormuz.
Yeah, let me just ask you, I've got about a minute, but it's important to cover this. You know, whether the understanding is that the ceasefire covers the GCC as well. Egyptian billionaire Najib Sawaris put out a post yesterday saying, if this ceasefire excludes Iran continuing attacks on the Gulf, this is a question that I think many in the region are posing. What is the understanding at an official level?
I think it's important to be cautious here, and because I mean, these things are not like the switch of a button, that's it, ceasefire, everything stops. So I think we have to wait. We have to be patient. We have to see how. I mean, obviously, the Gulf states have voiced their concerns. I mean, the UAE statement that I referred to, saying that it's actually seeking clarifications, is very important, and it kind of reflects the mood. And I think they're going to be watching very closely how things play out over the next hours, days. I mean, we know that the crucial meeting is happening on Saturday. So I think I would like be cautious in terms of like maybe jumping into conclusions here, because in a lot of these situations, war situations, things actually take a bit of time to trickle down. And as I said, there's also this concern that the hardliners now in charge in Iran have other.
Yeah. Sam, we're coming up to a hard break. Thank you so much. Sam Darir. That's it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. Daybreak Europe coming up next.